This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we will discuss Chapter 10, Age and Ability, Barriers to Participation and Inclusion. Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. So I look forward to this one. It's become one of my favorite topics, probably as I've gotten older.
It becomes more and more relevant every year.
Right.
And I have been forced recently to reflect upon that myself, which is something we'll probably talk about in today's episode, sooner if not later.
Right.
All right. Well, let's get started. I want to focus on this concept that we raise in the chapter, ableist ideology. And we define that as interrelated ideas and beliefs that are widely used to identify people as physically or intellectually disabled, to justify treating them as inferior, and to organize social worlds and physical spaces without taking them into account. All right, pretty straightforward. It's in the textbook.
Right.
Of all of the forms of discrimination that we addressed, ableist ideology is actually, I think, probably the most ironic, since people who perpetuate ableist ideology will someday directly experience it themselves. So this leads to a question that I have. For those of us who are still young, or young at heart in my case, how might we enjoy our youth and our health without stigmatizing other people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because we grow up with this notion that there is this kind of ableist approach to life, or I'm using the wrong word there. You approach life through your abilities, and people who don't have certain abilities are going to have problems, when in fact, that's not how the world is divided. I mean, ability is an amazingly broad and complex concept. And I think that we have ignored the fact that ability variation is one of the most ever-present parts of human existence that we ever confront. All of us have different kinds of abilities. Abilities change in some cases from moment to moment, depending on what's going on, an injury, an accident, lack of sleep, all sorts of things. And so we don't acknowledge that there are these ability differences that have to be taken into account, not only in our lives, but in our relationships with other people. And sports sometimes leads us to ignore those differences, because sports are oftentimes sorted out through ability categories. And so we just assume that when we get involved in sport, okay, ability is a constant in a sense. I mean, there's minor ability differences here and there that account for winning and losing or doing this or that, but we're generally we're playing in a situation where we don't have to acknowledge or take into account or accommodate ability differences.
Jay, I want to ask a question. It's a little bit out of order in our list of questions. So I'm going to move one of the questions I had farther in up to right now, because, and I think it makes more sense to ask it now. since we were talking about ableism and ability, one of the things we argue in the chapter is that ability is a really difficult concept to define. Can you talk a little bit about why, I mean, it seems kind of straightforward, right? You can do something, you can't do something, right? You're able, you're not able. It kind of seems sort of straightforward, but why would you say it's such a difficult concept to define?
Well, first, it's not a sociology concept, because if it was, we would automatically take into account context. And that's one of the missing things in most discussions of ability is that all of our actions that require any ability occur in particular contexts. And those contexts oftentimes have characteristics that either create challenges to our ability or make things easier for us. So, uh, and and I think that we realize that in our own house and in the spaces that we control, because we can modify those spaces. But when we modify a space, we don't say, "Oh, we've engaged in an adaptive exercise." But but in the case of sports, I think that anybody who has grown up and not played a lot of informal games that involved participants with different abilities has never learned that playing sports and being inclusive requires some kind of an adaptive process, and that so we have to change the context in other words to make the sport happen, and we learn that in informal games. And I think as young people today are growing up without that experience, where so many of their activities are adult controlled, either the adaptations have already been made, or you're in ability categorized groups where you don't have to make adaptations. And so that whole process gets put off until we think it's odd that we have to make it. And so that's my point, is that the adaptive process is part of life. Ability differences are part of life. And there is no normal when it comes to humans and ability. So that's what I mean when I say it's an amazingly broad and complex category in human experience. Some people have experiences that enable them to be tuned into that, basically. And others, because of the way the world is age segregated and ability segregated in many cases, they're not forced to become attuned to it.
It's such a great point. And, I think about like the way that I even asked the question, able, not able, right? Or able, disabled. We have such a tendency to think of these things in such absolute terms. You either can or you can't, which is absolutely not the case. I mean, we're both wearing glasses, right?
I just thought of that.
Exactly, right? So it's not like we can see, we can't see. We both need to adapt to our environment so that we can see as effectively as possible.
Yeah.
Right. But there is something you said in there that I want you to dig into a little bit more, because I can imagine somebody listening and hearing you say it and then like shaking their head. One of the things you said is when it comes to ability, there is no normal. Can you talk about what you mean when you say there is no normal? Because I can hear someone saying, well, yeah, I'm normal.
Well, I think it's sometimes being critically self-reflective about yourself. I mean, when you say I'm normal, what are you including in that? Because we all have characteristics that are probably outside of normally accepted limits. And sometimes we hide those, and that's one of the things about technology in our lives now, is we can hide the things that are not normal about us. I wear hearing aids when I don't have these headphones on, and those hearing aids are really difficult to see. But that is something that is an ability issue that I have. Is I can't hear as well as other people, many other people, not all other people. And I'm finding out as I've noticed hearing aids, there's a lot of people wearing hearing aids. Maybe not as many as glasses, but eyeglasses. But we all have characteristics that compromise our abilities in some way, and we can say that they're not normal. But when you start looking around and seeing how many people are wearing eyeglasses, darn, how can we say that's not normal?
Well, I like the term the mythical norm. And I think that when people talk about normal, they're referring to this thing, the mythical norm. For instance, if we're going to say that something is normal, well, what exactly is the norm? What's the mathematical measure to determine the norm in human ability?
Yeah.
And and I think about that, it's like when I was a young man and very athletic, I mean, I certainly thought of myself as normal, right? I was like, this is normal. But in my own lifetime, let alone, compared to all humans, that was a relatively short period of my life. I mean, as a child, I could not perform physically the way I could as a young man, from my late teens through my 20s. And, I'm more than 20 years past the age of 30. And so that period, if I was actually measuring, that wasn't the norm, right? It wasn't like the majority of my life, let alone comparing me to other humans, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we actually come to this norm? It's more of a mythical norm, right? And again, myths are not lies, they're cultural truths. They're
Right.
things that we collectively and socially believe, even if they're not empirically measurable or they're not accurate. If we measure them empirically, they aren't necessarily accurate in some sense. So I think that's very powerful, this idea of the mythical norm. And then once we start poking at it, which is what we do as sociologists, we start to see that idea it doesn't have the integrity that we assumed it does. There's all kinds of exceptions, and there's exceptions in our own lives individually, let alone collectively across, if we're thinking about everybody across the whole life course.
Mm-hmm.
So this actually leads to my next question that I was hoping you could address. And this is like, again, responding to things that I hear from students. One of the things I hear from students sometimes, well, in some classes all the time, that sociologists and sociology is too negative. Right. And, obviously I don't agree with that, but I understand where they're coming from. Right. I'm not mad at them for seeing us as, I think one student said to me, it's the discipline of doom and gloom. And I'm like, okay, right. Like I get where you're coming from. So I want to highlight a positive insight from sociologists. And, we talk about ageism in the chapter and that we live in an ageist society. And so in this ageist society, we tend to see aging as a process of simple decline and loss, right? Like a narrative arc. You hit your peak and then it's all downhill from there, right? Or what's the joke? Once you're over the hill, it doesn't matter how far. And that's because we view elders as non-contributing members of society and that younger people must bear. And we certainly hear that when we hear talk about, like, say, Social Security and whatnot. So the question, Jay, is what are some of the ways that sports participation can also counter the narrative of decline?
Well, that's a good question, and one of the ways of doing it is to acknowledge, to keep your eyes and ears open to what older people are doing, and there is decline, but people adjust to decline, and they change the context in which they create challenges so that they can stay physically active, engage in meaningful activities, and do things with peers. And when I talk about peers, I'm talking about ability peers. I'm not talking about age peers, because one of the problems we have in the United States is that we have age segregated so much of our lives except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I'm saying that we need to eliminate some of the age segregation that exists in sports and physical activities. And there is no reason why older people can't play with younger people. And I've just joined a group in Europe called Joy, and it's a judo group where grandparents bring their grandchildren to judo, and they do judo exercises together. They go through the judo moves together. They actually take into account the ability levels of each other as they engage in this activity, physical activity. And the same thing can be done in sport, other more traditional sports. You know, we have golf and bowling that allows people of different abilities to compete with each other in a nice, friendly atmosphere because they have handicaps. And I'm talking about the numerical handicaps that are created, are calculated on the basis of your past ability achievements. And so if I have a handicap of 15 in golf and I'm playing somebody with a handicap of 1, we can compete with each other. And that's what makes golf interesting for a lot of people, and bowling as well. You go into a bowling alley on a league night and you see all sorts of different abilities competing together, having a good time because they've adjusted for ability differences. And let me give you a quick example of this in other settings. When I was working in England, I went up to Scotland a number of times during the years that I've worked in England, and I've gone to the Highland Games. And the Highland Games are local kinds of physical competitions, sport competitions, that are totally, in most cases, integrated: age, gender, ability. And so what happens is if you want to participate in the Highland Games 100-meter race, you turn in your 100-meter times. And what they do is they calculate a starting line for you. And if you're the best person in the race, you start at the regular 100-meter race starting point. But if you're a 65-year-old who's still sprinting and you've turned in your time, you start ahead of that person a certain number of yards so that you're going to finish at the same point unless you're really better that day. And so I've seen races with people of many different ages, different men and women, competing together and all finishing within 2 yards of each other at the end of a 100-meter race. And one of them that I remember, because I have photos of it, a 65-year-old beat the high school champion and the Olympic champion in Scotland because of this handicap system. And as they were going back to the starting line after the finish line, this 65-year-old had one arm around the high school, one arm around the Olympic champion, and he was telling them about how you can stay competitive as you get older and his training regimen and everything else. And he was teaching these champions how to get older. And that was something that stayed with me because age-integrated sports, could create relationships that would really pay off as people get older.
That's such a great story. And I was thinking about this because you started out in your response saying, well, let's put age integration to the side. Let's focus on ability integration. But you concluded with age integration because that was what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
My younger son, as you know, he just got home. He's only home briefly. He just got home from college. He's just finished his first year of college. He's home briefly. He has an internship. He's going to be taking off in a day for the internship. So we really want to maximize the time with him while he's here. And so my two sons and their mom, my wife, they went off to play pickleball the other day and they had a great time. And I think what the question here is, what is the values organizing the sports that you're participating in? If you're looking for some absolute measure of highest achievement, of greatest performance, the traditional competition model that we grew up with in our school sports and our club sports and those the Olympics and whatnot, then it's absolute and it's not inclusive. It's the opposite, right? It's elitist. It's elitist by design. But for most of us, most of the time, we engage in sports for pleasure, right? Yeah, there's pleasure in winning. I get that. I'm a competitive person, but mostly it's about the relationships we have with people. You talk about to like high school football players and you ask them, what is it that you really love the most about high school football? Like, what gets you through the hell weeks? And they'll say, overwhelmingly, it's my friends. It's the other people on the team with me, right? Hell week is horrible, but we're suffering together. It's a bonding experience. My wife with our two boys, that's a bonding experience. The value is not conquest. The value is integration and solidarity, which is really, really different, but it's something that we can think about when we plan, create, participate in different sporting activities.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not going to go into detail on my examples that reaffirm what you just said, but just one quick one is that when we were doing our wind sprints and our 440s and our 5-mile run, getting ready for basketball season in college, and we were out there on the track and, people were puking in the buckets, after they were doing sprints and everything else. And we hated that. But you know what we did after we were exhausted? We went into the gym, we picked up sides, and we played an informal game of basketball. And half the time they were half-court games because we were so exhausted. But those were so pleasurable. Those were the things that got me out to the track the next day. And because I knew that if I wanted to play basketball and have the pleasure associated with it and the bonding that occurs with it, I had to get into shape. So, but it was those informal kinds of things that are the bonding experiences that you have that provided the foundational motivation for me to get and stay in shape.
So I want to push back a little bit on what you and I were just saying and challenge us a little bit. I'm challenging you, Jay. You're the one that's going to respond. I'm just asking questions. So we talked about my wife and her playing pickleball, and she's nearly a 60-year-old woman now, right? She's a couple of years older than me. And that's all great. She can play with her, 19 and 22-year-old sons, and that's wonderful. But there is a limit to this, right? We tend to think that all elders can play pickleball, that it's a retirement sport, and we know it's not just a retirement sport, of course. But there are limits to this, right? There are elders who physically actually can't play pickleball. Maybe you can talk about this aspect as well.
Yeah, I think that we underestimate the number of people who have physical characteristics that either preclude or make participating in certain physical activities difficult. And the reason that we can do that is that a lot of times people who have those characteristics stay inside. They are either embarrassed to go outside and show that they have some a characteristic that compromises their ability, or they're pissed off because the environments have not been adjusted to accommodate for their characteristic, uh, or they don't have other people who are willing to, in a sense, participate with them and make adaptive changes in the activity so that they can participate equally. And my point there is that all three of those things, all three of those reasons, are things that we ought to think critically about. So, first of all, why are we embarrassed? Well, it's because of the stereotypes that are associated with so-called disabilities. And we don't want to be labeled as having a disability because that automatically leads to differential treatment that disadvantages us. And the second one is it's a pain in the neck to make adaptive changes unless you've had good experience doing so. And thirdly, adapting the environments are difficult in many cases. You have to pick and choose environments where you can actually make other adaptive changes that make equal participation possible. And as a person with a particular characteristic, you don't want to put that challenge on people because most people haven't had to face it. And what I'm suggesting here is that we need more opportunities in our overall growth and development within schools, within sports, within physical activities to make those adaptive changes, to understand that all of us are not the same when it comes to abilities, and that if we want to really be human and create abilities that are inclusive, then we have to be able to be creative with our adaptive capability potential. And I think that anybody who's worked with Paralympics, with Special Olympics, or has had a relative with a particular physical characteristic that compromises their ability, and they live with that disability, you start to understand that normal is kind of an irrelevant term. The challenge here is to be inclusive in ways that creates challenges for everyone. And that's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great point. And I think it's tricky because we're not good at that.
Yeah.
We've grown up in a society that expects people to adapt to institutions. We don't expect institutions to adapt to people, right? But what you're saying is if we want to be inclusive, if we want to be democratic, then we need to make our sports and other institutions both inclusive and democratic so that people can participate and people can participate fairly. Yeah. I think that's just a great point.
Yeah. And by the way, Special Olympics has tried to do that because they were criticized so widely for creating events that actually segregated people with intellectual challenges from everybody else. And so now they've created their unified sports, and which is, I've gone to high school unified sport events, and they're really great. They're not the end all, because I think we need more kinds of unified activities, not just with people with officially labeled so-called disabilities. We need opportunities to understand how we can take into account ability differences and still create challenging activities for people. Collective activities, team activities.
Right. Absolutely. So, one of the things I like to do with students when I teach this chapter, Jay, is to get them thinking about larger forces in our lives that affect our sporting choices. Because we tend to just think of ourselves as we just make choices on our own. But of course, in sociology, we say, no, that's not true. we're always making choices in concrete social contexts. So I'll say, like when I was a kid and I didn't have many responsibilities other than school and a handful of chores, I had all sorts of free time. And I did all kinds of different sports, just as you did. We've talked about this, a number of different times. And that ran through my 20s, really. But then as I began to build a professional career and raise a family, I didn't have that much time in my 30s to not only to do sports, but even to watch sports. I mean, I don't know, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, I didn't watch a single football game on television, which was like crazy because as a kid, I watched tons of football on television. But then the older my kids got, the more I could do sports with them and the more I could do things on my own. So now, I'm as active now, maybe not as active as I was when I was a kid, but this is the most active I've been since I was a kid. That is when I'm not recovering from injuries. So yeah, so now it's like, it's great. I'm more and more athletic all the time. So instead of thinking about growing up as a time when we get serious and don't do sports, how might students listening to the podcast think about life development that can both facilitate and restrict physical activity?
First of all, there's all sorts of physical activities, and we can create challenges that match our abilities at different points in our life course, and that's something that I think our whole idea, our conception of sport interferes with. We see sport and we always look at it in terms of practicing, getting better, achieving more victories, improving our record. The emphasis is constantly on improvement, given a stable set of rules and a particular context that's been defined for us and, in many cases, imposed on us. And I think that we have to be, as we get older, or as abilities change, we have to dump or at least not use that conception of sport as some kind of a sacred concept and talk about modifying. And I know I've said this before, but what the challenge becomes is creating controlled physical challenges for ourselves and the other people with whom we're engaging in physical activities or creating new sport activities with. And, as a father with little kids, and you've experienced this, but, when I wanted them to learn how to play tennis, I wasn't going to go out there and teach them how to have tennis competitions. What we did was we created games. How many times can we hit the ball over the net without failing to do so? And so I learned to hit balls that were easy for them to hit, then learned how to hit balls back. And our goal was to hit 100 times without missing. And by the way, that improved my tennis ability. It improved their tennis ability. It was fun. It was a controlled challenge that we had created for ourselves. It was a cooperative challenge rather than a competition. And that's something that got into my head. And when I started working with Special Olympics and with other kinds of Paralympic organizations, I started thinking in the same terms. How can I create something where I can go out there and do it with them and have a good time and have a controlled challenge for all of us? And that's what I'm talking about with respect to inclusion, is that it forces you to be creative, not just as you get older, but as your abilities change, as you're doing injury rehab, all sorts of things. And And I think that we get stuck with this model of sport that presents competition in a particular kind of a perspective. And we have to learn that, all those physical activities are modifiable. We can engage in an adaptive process and have controlled challenges for all of us. And so it's a combination of cooperation and competition.
We,
And that's an important thing to remember, that all competition rests ultimately on cooperation. And unless we learn how to cooperate and how to create cooperative activities, we're never going to be a good competitor.
right. It's such a great point you brought up, that we make competition sacred. And so then it can't be questioned. It has to be a good, it brings out the best in us, and all the sort of like things that we say about what makes competition such a sacred thing in our lives. And it's just not true. I mean, so like, one of the things you were talking about, the tennis that you did with your kids. Well, when my kids played my two boys played youth flag football, I coached them. Everyone was like, "Oh, your kids are such great athletes," and they're good athletes. I'm a proud papa, and they could throw as well or better than anyone else in their league. They could catch as well or better than anyone else in their league. But we started out when they were very small, and it was the three of us would be in the yard together with a football, and we stood very, very close to each other, so that it was like impossible not to get the ball to the next person and catch it. And then we'd just start moving back, and we would see how long and how far apart we could get. And that was the challenge. It wasn't a competition. No one's trying to beat anybody. It's all cooperative, but we're constantly challenging each other. And I think that's such a great metaphor. I mean, yeah, competition can be really exciting and it has its place, but challenges, we really, I think, as human, or many of us, if probably most of us, enjoy being challenged and overcoming those challenges and having that feeling of success. And competition can provide a challenge, but that's one type of challenge. And so my kids developed a lot of physical literacy just doing that simple activity. And we did others that we came up with as well, so that when they showed up at the park, they seemed really advanced, because relative to many of the kids in their league, they absolutely were. They were very advanced in that regard. And so, and then I think about it for myself. The mountain biking I do right now, it's like, there is no competition. I don't go to races. I won't go to races. It's one of the few things in my life I can do where I can like intentionally make it non-competitive, because I am a competitive person. So I have to be intentional about minimizing competition. And that's a choice that people can make. But what I love about it is the sets of challenges I can create for myself. I live at the edge of the Rocky Mountains. And so every ride starts with a minimum of an hour climbing. Well, that's a challenge to get up these like literal mountains. And so I might climb for an hour, 2, 3 hours. And then there's the descending. Well, these are now insane descents to get down these mountains without hurting yourself, right? And so there's a lot of conditioning that's required, and there's a lot of skill development that's required to be able to do these rides successfully. And I can constantly get better. I can constantly improve my fitness and my skills until I reach a point where I can't keep improving them anymore, which is something we can come back to. But it's a constant set of challenges that is very pleasurable for me. And that's one of the reasons why I teach mountain biking to kids now. Because I think it's like, it's a great sport in that regard. So again, it's a lot of this, and what you've been saying throughout here, this episode, is it's about the mental frameworks we have. What are the values guiding the activities? How are those values guiding how we organize those activities? because that impacts the outcomes.
Right. And let me just relate this back to the second episode we ever had on the first chapter, when we talked about play being a crucial component of sport. And, play is basically an activity where you create controlled challenges. And when you watch little kids play, they're doing that very thing. And I think that whole notion of creating controlled challenges is something that ought to be part of physical education. It's related, it's as important as physical literacy, because it's one of the ways through which you develop physical literacy is by creating these controlled challenges. And there's no reason that they can't exist within some kind of a competitive context. And that's another, I heard a statement a number of years ago about competition where somebody told me, competition in sport is like salt in cooking. If you use too much, you're going to ruin the meal and destroy a lot of the inherent pleasures associated with that meal. And if you get too taken up with competition in sport, what you're going to do is destroy some of the other inherent aspects of enjoyment and pleasure in sport. And unless we're a professional athlete making our living by being a great competitor, there's no reason to make our physical activities overly competitive. We're gonna destroy a part of the pleasurable experience.
This is a little bit of a digression and jumping ahead to next week, but I've been thinking about this, or to our next episode. I've been thinking about this with now that the NCAA is moving towards paying players. There's, they're setting a lawsuit, and one of the things that's going to happen is the already wealthy, powerful programs, particularly, and I'm really talking about football and basketball, the revenue-generating sports, they're going to become even wealthier and more powerful. And the schools, and this is particularly with football, because football is so expensive, for schools to be non-competitive at the highest levels of college football. I mean, the vast majority of colleges are never going to make it into the, the Final Four. I forget what they call it in football, but the bowl.
It's going to be the Final 12 now.
Right. That the bowl subdivision, the ones that will actually do the playoffs for the national championship. Right. The vast majority of colleges will never have a football team that comes anywhere close to the national championship, and it's only going to get more expensive to be competitive in that realm, and there'll be less money available to those schools. And I suspect, and this is just a hunch, that it's what I see is a historical repetition. Football began in what we now call the Ivy League. Harvard, Yale. I mean, they largely created football in the other Northeastern schools, many of whom are now in what we call the Ivy League. Well, the Ivy League, as I'm sure you know, Jay, it really formed in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Those schools were no longer competitive. They hadn't been competitive really since the first decade of the 20th century. So by the 1950s, they made the conscious choice to not compete with the top schools, to only compete with each other in what was in the 50s called de-emphasizing football. They minimized competition to create great games that their students and their alumni wanted to watch. Rather than getting blown out by Notre Dame or Oklahoma or USC or one of those 1950s powerhouses, they only played each other. And I suspect that that's something that's going to happen in a lot of schools in the coming decades, because they won't be able to compete at that highest level. And again, it's that you can minimize competition and actually create better events, more exciting, more pleasurable for everyone, and it doesn't have to cost so much money. And I'm sorry, it's a digression from. It's related, but it is a digression from today's topic, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in the next episode. Anyway, something that we outline in the chapter a set of distinctions between the medical and the social model of disability. And I don't think we need to go through all of those distinctions right now because it's in the book. People can just you'll see it if you haven't already read it. You'll see that when you get to it. But more generally speaking, can you talk about some of the ways that the social model corrects some of the limitations in the medical model of disability?
Yeah, I think that the medical model comes right out of U.S. culture's emphasis on hyper-individualism. And what we do is when it comes to medical issues, we look strictly at the individual. And, it's one of the reasons we've had such a hard time in our medical system creating preventive medicine and creating public health, and you'd have to go into some other cultures that are not so hyper individualistic to see how they've incorporated the social model into everyday life. And whereas in the United States, we tend to look at somebody who's got what we call a personal problem, and we don't define it as being connected with a social issue. And C. Wright Mills made that observation back in, I think, 1959. And when he wrote the book, The Sociological Imagination. And this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about being able to imagine a person in social context and find out what are the patterns in that social context that are creating unnecessary challenges for that individual. And I think that that's something that we need to devote a lot more thinking to. And I think that the social model provides us with a good basis for asking critical questions about the medical model. Now, there are certain aspects of the medical model that are fine. If I have a shoulder problem, I'm not going to be looking for an environment where I don't have to use my right arm. Rehabilitation for my shoulder problem, if it's possible, is something that I want to know about, and I want an expert in it. So, that medical model is something that is part of how we need to think about things. But if it's the only way to think about things, we've ignored about 70% of the way we can deal with a lot of physical problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this really brings us to this norm other binary. And what do I mean by that? We go back to this idea of the mythical norm, right? We say that something is a norm, and then anyone that doesn't meet that norm becomes the other, right? They deviate from the norm. So in studies of deviance, this is obviously a central idea, but it's also been really central to studies of race, to gender, to sexuality, right? So this has helped us explain this norm other binary, right? Has helped us explain a lot. Well, how might a focus on sport and ability bring the political character of the norm other binary even more clearly into view?
That's a great way to raise a good critical question in our discussion here, because it raises the issue of who creates the norms and who has the power to decide what is normal and who has the power to decide what is an ability and who is able. So those norms get created by people who don't have to take into account differences. And so what happens is that they create norms that come out of their values, experiences, and interests, and abilities so that people who don't have the same values, experiences, interests, and abilities are going to be at a disadvantage. And that's where we need to start asking critical questions, is how do we create flexible normative environments within which stereotypes are not used, marginalization does not occur, inclusiveness becomes primary rather than exclusiveness becoming primary. And I think that sports and physical activities can be a context where we can experiment with those things, because sports are meaningless. And I don't want to raise an issue that we have to start discussing now, but sports don't produce anything in and of themselves. We give meanings to sports and we put sports in context where they have implications, but just going out and bouncing a ball, doesn't change the world. It's the context within which that occurs that can possibly have an impact on the world. And so let's not get too carried away with the fact that we can really do some physical thing better than anybody else, because it doesn't mean anything. If we can put it in a context where it can change the world in a better way, then that's the challenge. And I think that we need to be thinking about sport more in those terms than using professional and elite college sport and amateur sport as the only way to think about what sport is.
Well said. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is not the greatest basketball player simply because he dribbled the ball well and could throw a sky hook. He was he could actually change. He was actually able to change the world, right? Muhammad Ali was the greatest, not just because he could throw a punch, right? He could change the world, right? They could address the larger context in addition to being really, really good at their different sports. But I want to stay on this this issue of identities and intersectionality. So can you talk a little bit about how other social categories, right? We're not just talking about ability, but other social categories like race and gender and sexuality and class can impact people's access to sport resources as they age.
Well, by the way, sport resources have always been differentially allocated within society. And when you mention the term intersectionality, when you start adding gender, race, social class, ability to that, then what we're looking at is a stacked set of potential disadvantages to being able to engage in sport through the life course, and in the face of changes in your own bodies. So a woman from a Black woman from a lower income group who has never had the opportunity to play a lot of physical activities in the past, for her to look at the possibility of doing a sport at age 60 is just off the radar. And I think that, for the people who are taking issue with the use of the concept of intersectionality and how it creates unfair challenges, how intersectionality creates unfair challenges for certain people with certain characteristics, we have to take that into account if we're going to acknowledge the humanity in other people. This intersectionality, as we stack all of those identities on top of each other and all of the differential treatment that has gone along with those identities through the years, If we have to find ways to neutralize those, and that is one of the major questions that we're facing in society today. So, and in sports. So there's no reason that we can't have more uh, identity integrations in sports. Why don't we have half of all of our high school sports be male, female, integrated, gender mixed? Because when you get to be 25 years old, a lot of your sport participation opportunities are going to be gender mixed. And by the way, our education hasn't prepared you to do that. And that is a major problem with how we've organized our sports. So we need to get people together so that we neutralize that intersectionality and make adaptive changes in how we're doing our sports. It will make us more human in the process, by the way, and it will increase the humanity of, or at least our recognition of the humanity of other people who are different from us.
I want to make explicit something that I'm hearing that's implicit in what you're saying, right? An assumption you're making, I want to state it, which is this is about justice. And I know right now the term social justice can be controversial for some people, but the fact of the matter is we all have a concept of social justice. We might not use the term social justice. All that means is, what is your vision of a fair society? For a lot of people, justice is predicated on equality, which is to say we treat everybody the same. But that's not what you're saying, Jay, right? Your vision of justice is based on an idea of equity, which is providing people with the resources that they need in order to be able to participate. So we don't treat everyone the same, because if we treat everyone the same, but they're not starting in the same place, we're going to end up with unequal outcomes, right? If one person has to run 10 yards and another person has to run 40 yards, well, it's not fair. And that's what you mean by adaptive. We would then adapt that so that there would be equality is achieved through a practice of equity.
Equity.
Yes.
And I wish I had mentioned that earlier so we could have talked about it more. But, I have a granddaughter who has cerebral palsy. She had a stroke in the womb. Her left hand and arm don't work. She needs a brace on her left foot, ankle, and calf. And over the years, we have done 10K, 5K races together. We have trained together. We have skied together. We have played tennis together. And in every one of those activities, I have had to, and she has had to, give me suggestions about how we can engage in adaptations. And I have videos of her that I put online on skiing sites where she learned to pole, because she could only use one pole skiing. She learned to pole between her legs when she was going up inclines. And I have two bad shoulders from too much competition when I was younger in certain sports. And I find that poling with both poles between my legs, even though it looks kind of crazy, is much more effective than poling outside where my shoulders are killing me. So what she has taught me by just watching her make these adaptations herself is she has taught me to make adaptations as I've coped with injuries, with changes in my own body. And that's something that really comes out of this equity issue that we all have to acknowledge. When she gets into a bike race, if everybody else is on a two-wheeler, she's on a three-wheeler because she doesn't have great balance. So what does that mean? It means that we've created equity so she can race. And I've seen the same thing done on ski racing and in all sorts of other physical activities and sports. So that's the equity issue is very crucial. It's not equality, like you say, it's providing people with the opportunities, experiences, and adaptive changes so that they can participate as equals.
You know, Jay, you're really anticipating my last question here, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and so you'll kind of repeat yourself a little bit, but you're repeating more formal language, and I want to close on a positive. So, to what degree can disability sports lessen exclusions and impact what we in the chapter call the empire of the normal?
Yeah, well, first of all, it can help us uh, ask critical questions about the concept of normalcy. And as this is, by the way, is a real challenge for the Paralympics because they have assumed from the get-go that if people watch the Paralympics, that they're somehow going to become more open to adaptive activities and they're going to be more sympathetic, both personally and politically, with legislation that opens the door for environmental changes, for access, for accommodation, and so on. And that hasn't happened. And one of the reasons is that the Paralympics has been presented in a way where the athletes are either super crips, in terms of the terminology used, or they're using technologies that make their personal characteristics, ability characteristics, irrelevant. And so the focus is on the technology and the super crips rather than on the adaptations that have to be made. And the Special Olympics has tried to accommodate that with their unified sports. That's a step in the right direction, but it's a really little step. And the Paralympics is still trying to figure out how to deal with that. How can we actually create more awareness of physical ability differences without the stereotypes, without the ableism and the ableist ideology that comes along with that. And I think that's a real challenge for the Paralympics. But anybody who's participated on a local level with people that have different abilities, some of whom have official disabilities, has learned that it takes real creativity to make a joint activity. Now, I've had that experience in a number of different cases, not just with my granddaughter, but with working with Special Olympics and some Paralympic-like sport organizations, where immediately I have to start thinking about how can I get in there and do this with them? And I have to start thinking of adaptations.
Hey, Jay, before we go, you used a term that some of the people listening might not be familiar with. Supercrip. Can you go ahead, just take a moment and say what that means?
Yeah, supercrip is a term, and I don't know exactly who used it first, but it was connected with the Paralympics or the competitions that occurred even maybe before the Paralympics had an official name. But the supercrip was the term that was used for someone who had created a personal way to engage in a physical challenge that nobody else could do. And, in other words, they could do things that other people who had a similar physical a disability, or they were living with a similar disability, couldn't do. And that supercrip was someone who had either come up with a particular way of doing something, or using a particular technology. And so the supercrip was always somebody separate from everybody else. And so that's messed up the possible carryover. It didn't inspire people. What it did was it created a new identity category without changing anything related to context or to the use of technology and how technologies have to be adjusted and so on and so forth. But it didn't change the world in a better way. It just created a model that was so difficult to imitate or to match that it was separate and in a sense irrelevant, other than just the oohs and ahs that went along with watching the supercrip perform.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people who haven't heard this term to understand, right? It developed in the disabilities literature as a critical concept, right? To criticize the way in which some disabled people are represented, particularly in media. And the point of this, as one category, the supercrip, the point of it is you look at the person in awe. Oh my God, they have overcome this terrible disability and they can do things that nobody else can do. And as you said, Jay, it ultimately ends up just reaffirming the status quo, not actually challenging it. And that's why it's a critical concept.
Yeah, and preventing political change.
Yes.
Because people watch the Paralympics, and instead of saying we've got to do more things to be inclusive of people with certain kinds of physical characteristics and certain kinds of disabilities, why can't everybody be like the supercrip? It's your responsibility, you with a disability. We don't have to change the environment. We just have to get you motivated to become a supercrip. And that is a political dead end.
Right. Absolutely. All right. We better wrap things up. Thank you so much, Jay. Another great episode.
So I enjoyed this one, and I enjoy them all, actually. And I'm looking forward to the next one. It's going to be a little bit of a change in terms of the whole perspective we're using. We're going to start talking about commercialization and rather than some of these inequality chapters that we've been talking about, but it's going to lead us in a different direction, and that's going to raise all sorts of interesting issues.
That's right. And I am looking forward to it. So our next episode, we will discuss Chapter 11, Sports and the Economy. What are the characteristics of commercial sports? And it is something that I definitely love to talk about. All right, Jay. See you next time.
All right, Jeff. Take care.